Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about modern authentication and its relationship to Microsoft Entra ID, and give everybody a little bit of a background on modern authentication, demystifying some of it, especially as it corresponds to Microsoft Entra ID. My name is Randy Robb, and I'm a principal consultant here at Oxford, and I help people solve people's issues with their modern identity using Microsoft solutions. And of course, my slide isn't progressing forward. There we go. This is our agenda. We're going to go over like the overview, some definitions, go into detail about federated identity and how Microsoft deals with that. Anyway, here's a list of everything that we're planning to talk about today. This is our promotional slide for our services. This is a little bit about our background. We've been around for a while. We started out a long time ago focusing on Identity Manager, Microsoft Identity Manager, and all the iterations before that. But we've evolved into doing all kinds of security for Microsoft, especially focused on identity. And some services we provide planning services, deployment services. One thing that's missing from the deployment services list I see is B2C. We also do a lot of B2C integrations. That's not there, but we do also do managed services too. So everything that is related to identity and security within Microsoft, that's pretty much what we handle. And now I'm going to start talking about what you guys really want to hear about. The overview of modern authentication and authorization. Well, basically, what modern authentication and authorization is all about getting a token. Something, an application, a resource, whatever, wants to get a token so that it can access resources. So that the application has to ask some security mechanism to say, hey, I need this token. And before the security control of the IPDP can give you that token, it has to do certain things like authenticate you, you have to be part of a group, whatever. There are security controls there. And if you meet all those successfully, then you will get a token. And then once you get a token, then what you need to do with that token is to hand that token off to some type of resource. And then that resource should respect that token, what you want, what you're authorized for, and give you the data that you're asking for. And that's that's SAML, that's, well, let me go to the next slide, which shows what the protocols all are. And that the previous process that I talked about has to do with SAML, OAuth, and OIDC. Those are the ones, that's the whole concept of that, is to be able to get a token and use that token. SAML is an older protocol, and it's set up a little bit different. You have different terms. I'm not going to really talk too much about SAML today. I'm really focused on OAuth and OIDC and OAuth, really. So OAuth and OIDC are relatively newer protocols of getting a token. OIDC is actually OpenID Connect, where it extends the OAuth protocol so that you can get a different type of token. It's called an identity token, ID token. And you use that to get information about the person, the user that's authenticated. It shouldn't be used for any type of resource access. It's there to really give the applications an idea of who that person is and to change the interface if necessary for that person, but not to access data. And you'll hear some of these terms, and in general, this is non-protocol specific. And if you're in any Microsoft webinars or anything, you'll hear things like security broker, security service, things like that. I just want to talk about these. These are more like conceptual concepts. They're not tied to any protocol. You'll hear a requester. That's usually a person or a service that wants to be able to get a token. They want to use a token to get to something. A security broker would be something like your desktop or your mobile device where a browser is actually part of that environment. The security broker is the surrounding thing where the application lives. That could also be a browser. A browser could be a security broker. It's the thing that actually is responsible for handling that token. The application itself is what will go and ask for the token and then use a token. Doesn't have to be the same application, but it's going to use a token. It's either going to get a token or use a token. And the token lives within the security broker. And the security service, which would be like your IDP, that actually handles the security of giving the token to the application. The token itself, in some systems, you have the what's called an opaque token or a JOT token. In Microsoft Entra environments, the token is a JOT token. They don't deal with opaque tokens. Opaque tokens are tokens that you can't read. You have to decrypt them. It's up to the application or the ID in communication with the IDP to decrypt that token to see what's inside those contents. And like I said, Entra uses JOT tokens, which is a JSON representation of the claims and the audience and all the attributes that are within that token. And a little bit less talked about, we do talk about resources. Resources are like the APIs. Those are the things that consume the token. But I like to break that up into two different sections here, where you have the resource broker, because just like you have a security broker, you have to have something that looks at that token and determines if the token is correct. If it's not correct, if it's valid, what identity provider, who's the audience. You have to have some type of logic on your resource to be able to determine those things. So you have to have some type of code there in place, and I call that the resource broker on the actual resource itself. And then you actually have the data. The resources are usually APIs that do internal API calls to databases, or they have a SQL interface, or they have a MongoDB interface or something where they're actually getting the data for you based on your API request. Then, like I said, we're going to talk about OAuth 2 pretty much in this presentation. And really, it's all about a client asking for a token, and then the authorization service saying, hey, I'm going to go through this process to see if you can get a token, and then I'm going to give you a token. And the client, of course, is an application. And then once a client or the security broker has a token, it can use that token to get access to a resource. And so the application will take, hey, I've got this token. Here's my request to give me some data from this API. And it's going to send the token over in the header. It's an authorization header, and it'll deliver that token. And then the resource is going to have to look at that token and say, hey, is this okay? And what can I use this for? Is this right for me? And what authorization can I perform on this based on the token contents? The other thing that you can do from the client is not only request an access token, but you can request an ID token. Now, these protocols are, I guess I'll get into that in a later slide, but you can the client can request either an access token or an ID token, or both an access token and an ID token. So, but the important thing to remember, again, is that if you get an ID token, you don't use that to control access to resources. That's not what an ID token is for. An ID token is usually used for information on the person that authenticated. So let's say you have an application and you want to display their name, their address, or any other attributes you get from the ID token so that you can change that interface. But it's not to be used for any type of authorization. So let's look a little bit about the details on the OAuth protocol. Now, if you look online and you look at, and I've done this when I was starting to try to learn this stuff, you'd look and you'd find out what is the OAuth 2 protocol, and you'd look at other presentations of people talking about, the authorization server, the resource server, blah, blah, blah. And it's really hard sometimes, at least when I was learning about this stuff, to really look at that protocol and look to see something like Entra ID and how it uses it, because really when you typically a lot of those OAuth instructions, it might be different now, but when I started learning about this a few years ago, it was all centric around like integrating with social identity providers. And it would give examples like Facebook and how these things work with Facebook. And really, you've got this application that wants to integrate with Facebook, so you're using OAuth 2 to integrate with Facebook with your application. So it's a little bit different than the way Entra ID handles it. So it's kind of hard to relate some of these terms, but I'm going to try to explain a little bit of these protocols to make it easier for you when you think about Entra and how it handles it versus some of the generic stuff you might get on the internet. But there are 4 things that are defined in the OAuth 2, and that's an authorization server, a resource server, the client, and the resource owner. And basically what happens is the authorization service is your IDP. That would be Entra ID. In Entra ID's case, if it's Ping or Okta, that would be the identity provider there. That's the authorization service. And what you typically do is write an application, which is a client. I think I showed this here. You'd write an application that would request a token. So your client's going to request the token. And that token, that request then is going to go to the authorization service, and the authorization service itself is going to have certain rules set up saying, okay, well, if you want this this token, first of all, you have to register your client ID so that the authorization service knows that this is a legitimate application. But it's going to send its application ID over to the authorization service, and it's going to say, hey, give me a token. Well, it's not going to give you a token right away. You've got to do something. Either the end user is going to be redirected, or you need some stuff within your request itself. Like I said earlier, I'm not going to go into the details of like client credentials or ROPC or anything like that. I just want to generically show that, hey, you have a request. It's going to either go to the authorized endpoint or the token endpoint, and then you're going to go through some type of authorization process. And once that goes through, on the authorization service, you have a response. Where are you going to send that token when you're done? When everything is done, you've checked off all the boxes. That's a redirect URL, and that's going to send the access token and the ID token, if you want the ID token, back to that redirect URL. Typically, that is the application. So the application will be written so that it's going to send out the request, and then it's going to have a listener to it where that redirect URL is going to go, and now you're going to consume that token within the application. So those are the 2 things for client and the authorization service. Now we have the resource server. So the resource server is the thing that will take that access token. So you're going to have an application, it's going to have a token, you're going to give it to the resource server, and that's what is actually ingesting the access token and applying authorization as it sees within that access token. And there's one more thing that we have to talk about. We've talked about all this process here of the client making a request, the authorization service going through whatever authorization it needs to do, and then it's going to give back a token to the redirect URL, send it off, and then once you get it, now you can make a request to the resource server. But there's one more thing that the protocol talks about, and that's the ability to grant access. So within the protocol, there's something called the resource owner, and that's usually the requester. So this makes sense in an environment like Facebook, because you're going to connect to an application and then you're going to authenticate to Facebook, and you've got a Facebook token, and this application now says, hey, I want to look up all your contacts. Is this okay? So you're actually giving permission for that application to go and talk to that API to get your contact information. So since you're the owner, in quotes, of that data, because you're managing it, Facebook is allowing you to manage it, you can actually give permission to this application to get those contacts on your behalf. Now, this is one thing that kind of confuses me, and it still is confusing, I think, when you're writing applications to Azure Entra, because it uses OAuth and it needs this. This is part of the protocol. But when you're dealing with a business application and you want to get business data, you are not the owner of that data. You're given rights to that data by the organization. And so there are capabilities within Azure, within Entra, and I'm sure you've seen it where you apply, like, you can make that application that you've written for your business kind of bypass the ability to grant access, because you don't want the end user, if you've got a business application, you don't want them to be exposed to this, because it's going to confuse them. And of course it confused me too when I was trying to learn about this stuff. So there are ways to kind of get by that, because really the user is not owning that data. The company owns that data that is exposed via the resource. And this is just a diagram that shows, hey, that granting of that request, the asking if you'll if you're allowed to get access to this API, if you're allowing, like, this application to get your Facebook data, that's all done part of that authorization process. That whole thing is super important for your IDP, that authorization process, because that's how you protect the delivery of the token. And of course, you what I want to point out here is that if you want to get an ID token, then that has to be associated with the user. You can't get an ID token if the user is not authenticating. Like if you use a service-to-service call, you're not going to get an ID token because that's not a person. ID tokens are always associated with the user authentication. We talk a little bit about security and that authorization process. So like I showed earlier, you want to get a token. You have an application is asking for a token. And the IDP, like Entra ID, is going to say, hey, can I give this token? Well, what controls do you have on Entra ID? Well, within Entra ID, you have authentication. You have to authenticate, okay? But if you're in an SSO session, you don't have to authenticate, but there are still conditional access properties that that are controlling that token delivery. Group membership, roles, all this Microsoft, and there's also like where is it coming from, what browser you're using, is it a modern auth application? There's all kind of controls that you can put on the client who's requesting that token to ensure that that token is not given indiscriminately. It has to follow certain authorization processes per application, so you can control that per application, right? You can have one group, only a certain group get into an application. Well, that's all controlled via the authorization service within the IDP of Entra. And that's all to control. All that controls is just the ability to give a token. So if you pass all those controls, then you'll have a token. Now, resource servers, on the other hand, just get a token. Sometimes you have controls in place where it's only going to get a token from a certain IP address or whatever, but most of the time they're not that way. Resource servers get tokens. That's what they get. There's no connection between the token that you get and the resource server receiving it. The resource server, the IDP is out of the authorization service, is out of the picture at this point. It's all up to the resource server to look at that token and try to verify it itself to make sure that it's valid. And it's also responsible for applying whatever authorization is defined within that token, like scopes, group authorization, audience validation, token validation, role and scope adherence. That's all responsible of the resource service itself. So if you have a programmer, let's say, that doesn't understand this stuff, and he says, yeah, I'm just going to get a token in, and I got a token. This is good. Let me see what it has on it. And it just, that maybe it's an inexperienced programmer or whatever, he writes this API and he doesn't do it correctly. Well, the IDP isn't going to stop that from happening, because it's really up to the application itself to apply those controls. So a lot of times I see all this big processing in place to prevent someone from getting a token. Okay, so, but let's say a hacker got a hold of that token and then you put it into they get it, they send it to the resource server. Well, it has to be able to handle something like that. It's not gonna, there's no connection in Entra ID between that token and the delivery of that token. There are controls in place. Microsoft has additional controls in place, but really this process, according to the protocol, they're separate. So what I want to talk a little bit about is federated identity, because this is really important in learning some of the underlying structure of Entra ID. So when you have a federated identity, this is when you actually have an IDP, and maybe it trusts another IDP for that authentication. So you write an application and you federate with another identity provider. So you're a client, you're an application, you're gonna ask the authorization service for a token. Okay, so that authorization process of that IDP is gonna say, okay, well, I need to give you a token, but wait a minute, you're from an environment that needs to actually redirect to a different identity provider. So what it's going to do at that point is saying, okay, well, I need to go to that other identity provider to make a token request. So it's going to go to the external identity provider, and that authorization process that it has will then do certain things to make sure that it can get that token. So it's going to like authenticate you, grant access or whatever. And once you pass that, then that identity provider then gives that token, that external IDP token, to the authorization process of the original IDP. So that original IDP then needs to check it, just like you do if it's a resource, because at that point, that authorization service, the initial one, is a resource, and it's got to check it. You got to make sure the token's okay. It's okay. Everything matches up. Then what that authorization service to will then issue an access token to the application. But that access token that you get to that application is not the access token that you got from like the external IDP. That's gone. That's part of the original, that's part of the authorization process that the source IDP used. And it's going to give its own access token. So it's important to understand this, of how identity providers actually federate to other identity providers, so that you learn how to integrate with Entra ID. This is kind of important. And this is why. So let's say you have a non-Microsoft Entra ID. Let's say you just have a generic identity provider, Ping or whatever, and you're using the same vendor for that IDP. And you have a partner organization. So what you typically do is company B user wants to get access to a company A application. So it's going to go to company A's IDP, and it's going to have an authorization process, right, that's involved, and that says, oh, well, we've set up a trust, a federation trust between company A and company B, the same vendor, but you have to set up that trust. And so now that authorization process is going to go to the external company B that you have this trust with, and then it's going to go through its authorization process, and it's going to ask you to authenticate. If you haven't already authenticated, it's going to go through company B's processes. It's going to return the company B access token. Like I outlined before, company A will get that access token and then give you a company A access token based on company B's authentication. And so what you have to do is you have to manually set up that trust between the two. If you've ever set up a federated trust between identity provider, let's say in Facebook or something like that, you have to create applications on each side, and you have to exchange a client ID or client secret or whatever. It's kind of similar to setting up a SAML trust, but you have to have some kind of trust there. But in the Microsoft environment, they're called B2B users. And so you don't set up any trust between those two. Those two, if you have another Azure tenant that you're dealing with, it's a partner organization, you can add them as a B2B user. You don't even need to do that trust. There's no need to set up that federation. They're already there. And there's no need for this. And this is one of the things that it's confusing to talk to clients, or when I talk to clients, they find it confusing because we talk about B2B users, but they also are available with this concept of federation. And you say, well, a B2B user is another tenant, but it's kind of, if you're coming from the background of traditional federation, you're thinking, well, how are these guys involved? Why is there no trust? Why can't I just add another Azure tenant user? How can I have a multi-tenant application? What even is a multi-tenant application? You have a single tenant? Oh, a multi-tenant application is where any Azure tenant can authenticate to, right? And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of weird and it's kind of confusing. So what I want to do is try to explain why that's confusing, or how that happens. How does this happen? And I have to mention that this next part that I'm going to go into is not from any technical documentation that I read from Microsoft or any inside knowledge. It's just my learnings from working with Modern Auth and how Microsoft deals with things, is, we integrate a lot. And this is pretty much my interpretation of how things work. And I don't want anybody to quote me on saying that what I'm going to explain next is actually how Microsoft works. It's my way of understanding and having it make sense based on Modern Auth that I know. I know Auth 2, I know OpenID Connect, I know all that stuff. And this is how I make sense of things. I just want to make that disclaimer at the very beginning. But this is stuff that you probably won't find by searching on the internet very well. I mean, you can put your own story together, but this is next stuff you probably won't find. So let's talk about Microsoft offerings. Okay, Microsoft has business applications, right? They have cloud applications in Microsoft 365. You can sign up for that. You have cloud services. You have Entra, Azure, the cloud service platform. You can sign up for, all kinds of services within Azure. Okay, so usually those are two separate types of subscriptions, but they also build other things like Windows 11. They do servers, they do devices, whatever. They do all kinds of things, right? But the two main things I want to talk about are the business applications and subscription-based cloud offerings. So those are cloud applications, right? Microsoft 365, and you have cloud services. And those services you need to subscribe to. And you don't necessarily get one with the other. You kind of do. But if you sign up for Microsoft 365 and you have all those apps and everything, you have Exchange Online, you have SharePoint and everything, you don't have access to any Azure services. If you sign up for Azure services, you don't have access to any of the Microsoft 365 applications, but there's something in common between both of them, which I find kind of confusing when I started out, is that they both rely on what? They both rely on Microsoft Entra ID, or it used to be the Azure AD, right? Before they renamed it, but it's Entra ID now. They both rely on that for security, right? And so what do you do when you want to get a service from Microsoft? You want Microsoft 365 or Azure. You're going to sign up. You want to sign up for those. Well, both of those require an Entra ID tenant. And because that's the security plane of those two things. And how do you get an Entra ID tenant? Well, an Entra ID tenant is an application that you need to have Microsoft Azure for. You have to have an Azure subscription before you can create an Entra ID tenant. Like, you can't just create an Entra ID tenant on your own, right? You need that. So basically, this environment becomes self-referential. You can't do things within this environment without something external coming in and creating that environment for you. So what is that external thing? Well, that external thing is, if you don't have any of these, is Microsoft Live, because that's the identity provider that Microsoft trusts for their services. So initially, let's say you don't have anything, you're going to sign up for a subscription. You have to have a Microsoft ID, right? A Microsoft Live ID. So because you need a Microsoft Live ID or an existing ID tenant to create a new one, when you create a new tenant, basically the identity that's used to create that tenant is tied to that new tenant. Like, if you have a Microsoft Live account and you create a new ID tenant, a new Entra ID tenant because you want an Office 365 subscription, then your Microsoft Live account is an account in that tenant. If you have an existing Entra ID tenant because you've created it using an Azure service, you can create as many Entra ID tenants that you want once you have an Azure subscription. If you create that and then want to create a license based on that, then what will happen, well, even if you create a new Entra ID tenant within your current Azure subscription, as soon as you create that Entra ID tenant that's tied to that Azure subscription becomes the admin of that tenant. So the result of that is all Azure Entra tenants trust each other with an OAuth federated trust, as well as Microsoft Live trusts it, because you're creating these applications, and due to inheritance, those things are there. So basically, this is the outline. Let's say that you have a new tenant, right? So you create a new tenant. Well, you create a new tenant. Basically, what is happening is the current tenant has to trust the new tenant has to trust the current tenant, because that's how you're managing it, is through that tenant. And of course, you can get rid of that, and you create a subscription or whatever, you can get rid of that. But this is basically the outline of it. And to me, that's how I make sense of all these trusts, that this B2B stuff that's happening within Azure. There are two links here that are important. I think that the slide presentation will be available so that you can get these links, but they actually talk about this. They allude to this in these two links. There's isolation. Microsoft purposely puts in, because they have this, they've got these isolation controls, so that even though all these things are trusting each other, they only have access to the defined identity providers that are directly related to them. So there is an isolation process here that happens. It's globally enacted via all of Entra ID, and they actually talk about it in these two articles here. So this is how they keep security. This is how they secure, even though all the tenants trust each other, even though Microsoft Live is a trusted identity provider, they have controls in place so that that isn't a factor in security. So what are the effects of this type of environment? Well, the effects are the concept of Microsoft B2B users. So that's really what B2B users are. They're these trusted entities where you don't have to create. That's a benefit that you have. So if you're a partner organization and the other partner uses Entra ID, then you already have a built-in process of trust. You don't have to create those federated trusts. You also have the ability. You also have an organization. Some may not see this as a benefit, but I do. That Microsoft is controlling the security between these tenants. So let's say if you have another identity provider and you just set up a federated trust, well, you're relying on each organization to make that correct. Whereas within the B2B trust, Microsoft has this in place and they're owning it. And they can make that super secure because they've got all the experience and everything, and they have these the ability to control that really well. Some of the other things that come out of that are the weird things like when you go into an application and you create an application, well, you can choose it to be a multi-tenant, single tenant, integrate with Microsoft Live. Well, that's why, because they all have this trust in each other, and you have to tell the application what authorization server basically it's going to be registered on. If you see here that the tenant level authorization services, you go to login.microsoftonline.com/tenant ID, that means the authorization, that's really the authorization server. Now, I'm not saying that these are separate entities out there, but within the OAuth protocol, that is the authorization service. So if you're a multi-tenant application, then this is the authorization service that you're going to go to, login.microsoftonline.com/organizations. So within the OAuth context, that's the authorization service. Same thing here. If you are writing an application where all Entra tenants and Microsoft accounts can use, then that's going to be registered in the common authorization service. That's what that represents. And when you do things like that, let's say you're writing a multi-tenant app, then you know that you have to look at when you're verifying the token, where it comes from. There are certain things you have to do to ensure that token is secure by making sure that it's the tenant that it's supposed to be for in a multi-tenant application. There's things that you have to do that are special, but this helps me to really see clearer what's going on in relation to the OAuth protocol. One of the things too is that because there's this isolation and these trusts and everything, I think, and again, this is my own personal belief, I don't have any direct ties to the product team to say this, that it's a lot easier for them to create separate environments to secure the tokens when they want to do customer identity and management systems there when they deal with the B2C tenant. Because really what you're doing is you've got a completely separate authorization endpoint when you deal with these. Also the process is a lot different. When you go to this previous one here, if you go to like your tenant, if this is your authorization service, then you're using the Azure conditional access policies. When you go to B2C, you are using this other access policy here. The policy name is actually a custom authorization process that you can implement. Now, you can do some social identities within a regular Microsoft Entra tenant, and they also have a new preview tenant for SIAM stuff. But the way they deal with their authorization is different than B2C, because B2C you have a policy name, so you actually have to put that into the authorization endpoint. whereas the old business tenant where you can connect to Facebook or what's the other one, Google, or in the new preview tenant you have more options. But Apple also you can connect with the current Entra business tenant. But the way they do that is they keep the same authorization endpoint here, but they make it application specific. So when you create an application, you actually have to define what application is going to use social identities so that it can use the conditional access policies to offload authorization and authentication to another identity provider, as opposed to the B2C tenant where you're using your custom policy here. And so what I want to show you here is if you go to your tenant and you go to external identities, one thing I forgot to mention is that Microsoft really doesn't call this federation because they have their own term that they use called external identities. And external identities really mean anything that's not authenticated by the local tenant. So you'll have your authorization service, which is your login.microsoftonline.com / your tenant ID. So that authorization server is going to look locally to authenticate you. If it's not looking locally to authenticate you, then that's an external identity. So that means it's all these B2B users, all the other identity providers that you can connect to. That's all handled by this node right here. If you go here, this is a default Entra ID screen. You go to external identities here, and this is how you manage it. And so, for example, let's go to your one of these things called cross-tenant access settings. Well, what is that? Well, that is actually controlling how you integrate with other tenants that you trust. So let me show you this here. Right here, where Microsoft has this built-in isolation between the different tenants, that's really what you're managing. That's what you're manipulating here when you go use this. Let me get back to my screen here. When you're using this, you can actually change your organization settings. You can prevent certain users from going to certain B2B tenants, other external tenants. This is all for cross-tenant management. So you're actually able to manipulate what Microsoft has previously frozen really solid. So this gives you the benefit of a lot more control than, let's say, if you had a normal IDP where you set up a federated trust. Well, you'd have to write all these special rules, maybe, get deep into the trust and assigning certain groups across who can sign in. But because there's this underlying trust between all these tenants, then if you have a partner organization, you can finally control how these are, how this is working. In addition, you have the ability to synchronize identities now between these different B2B tenants, these other external tenants, which is really, really good. So if you have partners that exist in the Entra ID infrastructure, they coexist. It's really easy to set up collaboration between them. Other things I want to talk about here is you can see here that these two are the things that I said that there's a federated trust by default in place, right? Well, if you click on this, it says, hey, they're here. It's here already. How about this one? Oh, it's here already, right? Just like I said. And then you have these external identity providers here that you can set up. So let's say you set up Google. Well, this is a tenant trust with this identity provider. So what you have to do then is go ahead and when you create your user flows, as opposed to B2C where you can have other user flows, these user flows have to be connected to an application so that when you go to that application, conditional access will know to that you can direct that to this other identity provider. And what you see on your screen, I don't have it up right now, but when you want to authenticate to one of those apps, you'll have a little additional link down below that says use another way to authenticate, and then you can choose your other identity provider like Google or Facebook. Let's see. So that's pretty much what I wanted to tell you. I know that's a lot of information, and I probably spoke quick, or maybe I got some words jumbled, but that's all I have. I don't see any new questions, but I do have some questions that have already been brought in. So one question, I've got like a set of questions here that I will answer. And if you want to ask any questions, just go ahead and paste it and I'll get to it. So this first question is asking about PowerShell and command line tools. Let's say Okta Verify doesn't work with command line. So, well, PowerShell does have an application registration within Azure, so you can control conditional access rules, so you can control PowerShell, remote PowerShell sessions, so that's available. I can't go into details because I haven't specifically done it before, but you are able to do that. I researched this before this presentation, and there are several different solutions out there of getting this done, but that there is an ability to do that. Here's an interesting question. Another question that came in. There's any modern authentication options where we can rely on request header insertion and take action based on whether a header is found? Well, the answer to that is if you're doing B2C, then that's possible. If you're doing, it's an application proxy where you've got a business tenant and you've got the application proxy in place, and you are connecting to an on-premises application, then yes, you're able to do that. If you're talking about just a normal OAuth application where you have to rely on conditional access, I haven't really seen any conditional access policies that'll allow you to inspect the sorry about that, to inspect the token. But what you can do, and when you're writing your application, I guess what you can do is before you make that authentication request or that authorization request, you could just see if the header's there and don't allow that authorization request if the header's missing. And there could be, there could be a way to do it, and I just don't know. While using modern authentication, such as phishing resistance, so basically this has to do with token protection, right? So you're saying, hey, I'm not going to give you a token unless you're a device bound. So you're doing conditional access policies. You have to be a part of an Azure domain joined device. Maybe Intune is restricting access, and it appears like there's some authentication that's required for some type of server access that you have to get through it. You don't have a device, you just want to be able to get to it from somewhere else, and you don't have that device protection. How do you overcome that? Well, one thing you can do, and this is what I've actually experienced this in the wild when I was working on a B2C project and we had to integrate with AWS. Well, what we had to do is use PIM for that. So basically I had to, if I wanted to get into the administration of AWS, then I had to be part of the AWS administrators group, and I had to ask access for that, right? So you use privileged identity management. So I had to ask for that. And since I was in a group that could ask, I had to put a reason, and I would get back a response, saying, hey, I'm being put in this group. And now I'm in a group where I can get the token. So you could do the same thing. These people that don't have they're not device bound. You know, you need to trust them, but they're not device bound. What you can do is set up PIM for them, and they would have to request saying, hey, put me in this special group for 10 minutes so I can do what I need to do, or 30 minutes or whatever. And they'd have to have MFA so you can be sure that they're the person and everything. And now they would bypass that conditional access policy of having that token. And of course, if that token got stolen, if their token got stolen, like with this control in place, their token wouldn't get stolen. But if the alternative is to just let certain people in certain groups do this, then of course their token may be able to get stolen. But if you put privileged identity management in place, there's more control over that. You've got MFA when it's required, and you can control those that token acquisition a lot tighter. And one more question here. And presentation's gone a little bit longer than I'm used to giving, so I guess that's good. ADFS specific, so you can have IDP per RDP, so relying party group, blah, blah, blah. So you want a particular application to go to a particular service provider, right? So a specific IDP. So basically what you would do, one of the ways you could solve that, I think that Jackie actually sent a response. I've written up some things, but what you can do is if it's a federated identity and you're federated with them, here's another way that you could do it. You go to external identities, and if you go to your user flows here, you can link a identity provider here. You can link a SAML. If it's a SAML trust, you could link that with your particular application. And in this way, that application would be tied to only this particular identity provider. So that's another way to look at the answer. I think I answered a little bit differently in the response, but that's another way you could do it. You could play with it that way. So we're here. How to get started? Okay, if you want to play around with this stuff, I would say, okay, get a free Azure subscription. All you need is a credit card and a Microsoft Live account, and then you can get a free Azure subscription. You can also join the 365 developer program. But here's an issue that I haven't been able to get around with, and I don't have a recommendation because you join the Microsoft 365 developer program using a Live ID, and you also can get a free Azure subscription using a Live ID. When you go through either one of those paths, you get a unique Azure tenant. So I don't know how to tell somebody to join the two together. When I was working on it, I had to get a paid Azure subscription in order to get my 365 to integrate with my with the domain that was set up for that. So I started with the 365 developer program, and from that I got an Azure subscription so I could tie them together. Otherwise, these two will be kind of like disparate. Sign up for public previews. You can create a group free B2C tenant once you get your free Azure subscription. And also the community edition is free as well, so that you can start to create applications and integrate with Microsoft Entra. So that's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for showing up. Here's some contact information. We'll get back with you if you have any other questions that we didn't answer, or you can always email us and I can answer some questions for you if you don't have any. It doesn't look like there's any here. So this is the last chance. Ask a question. I don't see any. Okay, thank you everybody for showing up, and have a really good holiday. Thanks, guys.